I was standing in the middle of LAX, clutching a printed itinerary that meant absolutely nothing, and trying to understand how a life could change between the time you left your front porch and the time you stepped onto an airport tile floor. Emily, my daughter, and David, her husband, were already halfway to the security checkpoint. Emily's designer luggage wheels clicked across the floor like a metronome set to the beat of indifference. David didn't turn his head. Emily did, just enough to toss a sentence over her shoulder that would etch itself into my bones. "Mom, we only bought you a one-way ticket. You'll figure the return trip out." She said it with the casual tone people use to mention the weather. No hesitation. No apology. Just a statement meant to end a conversation I hadn't even realized we were having. There was a time when words like that would have broken me, and maybe they did for a second. But in the noise of rolling suitcases, boarding calls, and laughter from families gathering for their own trips, I heard something else beneath her voice, the sound of a door closing. Not a physical door, but the kind you carry inside. I didn't cry. Not yet. I stood there, in my thin sweater, no suitcase in sight, holding the itinerary like it could still shield me from the truth. They hadn't just left me without a ticket home. They'd taken my bag, my sense of belonging, and, for a moment, my breath. This was supposed to be one of those senior family stories people tell about healing after loss. Instead, it was the beginning of my own elderly resilience tale, one I never thought I'd have to live. That morning, I'd left Charleston believing I was part of something again. 2 months earlier, I'd buried my husband, Richard, after 45 years of marriage. The house had felt impossibly big, every chair holding an echo of his voice. Emily had come by with her softest smile and said, "Mom, a little trip will be good for you. We're all pitching in." She'd called it a healing getaway, and I'd wanted so badly to believe her. I even sold Richard's old rocking chair, the one he gave me on our wedding day, to help cover the cost. Now, I stood in the very airport where they had dropped me like an unclaimed package. The people rushing past didn't know they were seeing the exact moment I stopped being someone's mother in the way I had always been and started being something else, someone who would have to decide whether this would break me or remake me. I didn't move for a long time. The crowd flowed around me, a river of people with destinations, reunions, and vacations ahead of them. I was the rock in the middle, unmoving, watching life rush by on both sides. I should have felt embarrassed, but what I felt was something heavier, like grief had just shifted shape. 2 months ago, it had been about losing Richard. Now it was about losing the idea that my daughter saw me as anything other than disposable. A woman passed me, pushing a stroller. She gave me a polite smile, the kind strangers give to fill the space between eye contact and looking away. But as her gaze flicked down to my empty hands, no carry-on, no rolling suitcase, the smile wilted into pity. I tightened my grip on the itinerary, as if holding on tighter would somehow make it real. Just that morning, I'd woken up in Charleston with hope. It felt strange to even think about it now. Hope had been a stranger in my home since Richard's stroke. That day he died, I remember standing at the kitchen sink, watching rain slide down the window, and thinking it looked like the sky was trying to find its way home. My world had gone silent, not the kind of silence that soothes, but the kind that swallows you whole. When Emily suggested the trip, her voice had been full of purpose. "We'll go to California. Beaches, sunshine, you need that, Mom." David had chimed in, nodding in agreement. "It's time for a change of scenery. Richard would want that." I remember standing in my bedroom, opening the jewelry box I hadn't touched since the funeral. In the corner was the gold locket Richard gave me on our 25th anniversary, the one with our wedding photo inside. I didn't sell that, I couldn't. But I did sell the rocking chair. It felt like parting with a piece of our history, but I told myself it was for something that mattered, being with my family. It wasn't just about getting out of the house. It was about not feeling like the world had moved on without me. I thought I was stepping into one of those emotional senior stories you hear at church potlucks, the ones where families rally together after loss. I thought this would be a senior wellness story about healing on the road, holding hands on the beach, maybe even laughing again for the first time in months. Instead, here I was, standing under the fluorescent lights of LAX, realizing I hadn't been invited out of love. I'd been invited out of convenience, maybe even opportunity. And once they'd taken what they needed, there was no plan for me to return. I slid my hand into my sweater pocket, feeling for the one thing I hadn't given up, a small, worn envelope folded in half. Inside was $920 in cash, my break glass in case of fire fund Richard and I had kept for years. We'd added to it a little at a time, a 20 here, a 50 there in case something unexpected happened. Well, this was unexpected. I took a slow breath, turned away from the security gate where my daughter had vanished, and started walking toward the sliding glass doors that led outside. I didn't have a plane ticket, but I did have a phone. And in my contacts, under H, there was the number for Harold Bennett, Richard's oldest friend and the lawyer who'd handled our will. When he answered, I didn't explain. I didn't even say hello. I just said, "Harold, I need to update my will." And just like that, the story I thought I was living ended. A new one, my own senior empowerment story, began. The cab smelled faintly of pine air freshener and fried food. I sat in the back seat, my envelope of cash tucked securely into my purse, and watched Los Angeles blur into a string of gas stations, strip malls, and palm trees leaning in the wind. Harold Bennett's office was on Jefferson Street, tucked between a tailor shop and a small cafe that smelled like fresh sourdough. The building hadn't changed in 20 years. Same pale brick, same wooden door with his name in gold lettering. I had last walked through that door with Richard, signing our first will after he retired. Back then it was simple, everything to each other, then to Emily. Now, I was here to tear that page out of my life entirely. Harold looked older but steady, the kind of man whose handshake still told you everything you needed to know. "Margaret," he said softly, "I'm sorry about Richard. I should have come by." I sat down in the leather chair across from his desk. "Harold," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I need to remove Emily and David from my will. Every part of it." His brows lifted slightly. "You're sure?" I nodded. "They left me at the airport today. No ticket home. No luggage. After I sold Richard's chair to help pay for the trip." My voice didn't shake, but something in my chest did. The small, steady thump of my own pulse, reminding me I was still here. Harold leaned back, his eyes sharpening. "That's abandonment, Margaret. And possibly financial exploitation." "I don't care what you call it," I said. "I just know I'm not leaving them a single thing. I want it to go to someone who actually sees value in me." I slid a pamphlet across the desk. It was for Harbor Haven, a non-profit that supported older adults abandoned or mistreated by family. Housing assistance, legal advocacy, programs for active aging seniors who had been told they didn't matter anymore. Harold picked it up, nodding. "You've thought about this?" "I've been thinking about it since the moment Emily turned her back at that gate," I said. "I want them erased from the will. And I want the change notarized today." We spent the next hour going line by line through my estate, the small white house in Charleston Richard and I paid off after 30 years, the modest farmland my father left me, currently leased to a neighbor for grazing cattle, our savings, the investment account we'd tended like a backyard garden, a handful of CDs in the bank. It wasn't a fortune, but it was mine. And for the first time in years, I felt the truth of that word, mine. As Harold typed, I felt something strange rising in me. It wasn't joy exactly. It wasn't revenge either. It was clarity, the kind that comes when you stop asking why someone hurt you and start deciding what you'll do next. By the time I signed the papers, my shoulders had dropped an inch, as if I'd set something heavy down. I had come in carrying a wound. I left carrying a plan. The sun was setting when I stepped outside, the air warm but edged with evening coolness. I stood on the sidewalk, folder in hand, and realized I wasn't lost at all. The story wasn't over. It was just becoming one of those inspirational senior stories you tell not because everything went right, but because you learned how to stand when everything went wrong. The motel was nothing special. Beige walls, thin curtains, a single lamp with a shade slightly crooked, but the key turned easily in the lock, and the room was mine. That mattered more than the view or the bedspread. Privacy. Safety. A place to think without anyone else's voice crowding mine. I placed the folder from Harold's office on the small desk by the window. The papers inside weren't just legal documents. They were the first proof I had in months that my life was still under my control. I sat on the bed, running my fingers over the creases in the manila folder, and thought about Richard. He would have hated seeing me at that airport, not just because of what Emily and David did, but because I stood there frozen, holding my breath like I was waiting for permission to move. Richard used to say, "Maggie, if you don't take your own steps, someone else will decide where you end up." He wasn't wrong. I could still picture him in our kitchen, coffee in hand, humming something off-key, asking me where I'd hidden the cinnamon. 45 years of senior family stories lived in those walls. Birthdays with too much frosting, Thanksgiving turkeys carved just a little crooked, evenings on the porch watching the world wind down. We'd built a life brick by brick, laugh by laugh. And yet, the moment I signed those papers this afternoon, I knew I'd taken the first brick out from under the house Emily and David thought they still stood on. They believed kindness meant weakness. They believed grief had made me soft clay in their hands. But here, in this small motel room, I felt the first shape of something else. Resolve. I pulled out my phone, not to check messages, there were none, but to look up a place I'd only half remembered. Harbor Light Senior Community, on the coast of Oregon. I'd read about it in an article on Senior Wellness Stories, a place where active aging seniors lived independently but together, sharing meals, laughter, and activities that kept them thriving. Richard and I had once daydreamed about visiting. The listing showed sunlit common rooms, a courtyard garden, watercolor classes, and even a small library. It didn't look like a holding place for the forgotten. It looked like a place where people still had chapters to write. I thought about the next few weeks. I could stay here in California for a while, or I could go straight to Oregon and see if Harbor Light was more than a brochure promise. Either way, I knew I would never again hand my future to someone who saw me as an afterthought. I took a long shower that night, letting the hot water burn away the residue of airport air and old hurt. When I climbed into bed, I realized something. For the first time in months, I wasn't falling asleep dreading tomorrow. 2 mornings later, I was in the back seat of another cab, this time headed toward the bus depot. The driver was a woman about my age with silver hair pulled into a low braid. She asked where I was headed, and I told her, Oregon. She smiled like she understood without me having to explain. The ride north took the better part of 2 days with a layover in San Francisco. Through the window, I watched the landscape change from the sun-baked sprawl of California freeways to the cool, damp green of the Pacific Northwest. Ocean mist curled over the highway, and every mile felt like it was carrying me further from the airport's fluorescent lights and closer to something I could call my own. I had called ahead to Harbor Light Senior Community, half expecting them to say there was a wait list or no vacancies. Instead, the woman on the phone said, "We've just had a corner unit open up. If you can be here in 3 days, we'd be happy to show you around." When I finally stepped off the bus in this small coastal town, the air smelled like salt and pine. Harbor Light sat on a gentle rise overlooking the water, its white clapboard siding bright against the gray sky. The courtyard was ringed with raised garden beds, and in one corner, a group of residents were laughing over something I couldn't hear. The director, a tall woman named Sandra with kind eyes, met me at the entrance. "Margaret," she said, "welcome. We've been expecting you." She showed me the community spaces first, a sunroom with wide windows, a small library where 2 men were playing chess, and a kitchen where volunteers were prepping for the evening meal. Everything smelled faintly of lemon and fresh bread. There was no antiseptic sting, no undercurrent of being warehoused out of sight. "This," Sandra said, "is a place for active aging seniors who still have stories to write. We believe in wellness, in purpose, in connection." She gestured toward a corkboard covered in flyers, yoga in the courtyard, a watercolor workshop, a weekly storytelling circle. As she walked me to the corner unit, I felt the knot in my chest loosen. The room was simple, a bed, a small table by the window, a chair placed just so, but the view overlooked the garden, and I could hear the ocean if I opened the window. That first night, I didn't unpack much. Just a photo of Richard, the locket, and the folder from Harold's office. I placed them on the table like anchors. Outside, the garden lights flickered on, and I heard the low murmur of voices from the courtyard. Not the rushed, dismissive tones of the airport. Not the calculated politeness of family doing their duty. This was something else. Presence. It struck me then that this wasn't just a stopover. This could be the setting for my next inspirational senior story. Not the kind where someone rescues you, but the kind where you decide you're worth rescuing yourself. By the end of my first week at Harbor Light, I had joined more activities than I'd ever expected. It started small, a cup of coffee in the sunroom with Helen, a retired teacher who had a laugh so loud it made the windows rattle, then a watercolor class where I managed to paint a seagull that looked suspiciously like a duck. But the days stopped feeling like something to get through. They began to feel like something to be part of. Morning walks in the courtyard, breathing in the salt air. Afternoons in the library, reading next to the same man who was always working through a crossword puzzle. Evenings at the communal table, where someone always saved me a seat. It was in those small rituals that I felt the hum of senior wellness stories come alive, not about diets or blood pressure numbers, but about belonging, purpose, and laughter that bubbled up without warning. One afternoon, Sandra asked if I'd like to help with the community garden. "You've got a steady hand," she said, pointing at the way I was repotting basil seedlings. I thought about the farmland my father left me, the soil I'd played in as a child. And I realized Emily and David hadn't taken that from me. They'd forfeited it. Soon, Harbor Haven's director would be visiting to discuss transforming that land into a therapeutic garden for older women with memory loss. That night, I sat by my window, listening to the ocean, and my phone lit up. 16 missed calls. All from Emily. No voicemail. No text. Just her name on the screen again and again, like knocking on a door I'd locked for good reason. The next morning, there was an email in my inbox. Subject: Mom, we need to talk. Mom, we got a letter from a lawyer saying you've removed us from the will. We didn't think you'd actually do it. Maybe we handled the airport wrong. I can admit that, but we're still family. At least let us keep the garden. The kids love it. Please, just 5 minutes to talk. I stared at the words until they blurred. We didn't think you'd actually do it. That one sentence told me everything. They'd counted on my silence, my reluctance to make waves. They'd mistaken my love for a bottomless well they could draw from without ever pouring anything back in. Out in the hallway, Helen was calling for me. It was time for the weekly storytelling circle. I closed the laptop and walked out, leaving the email unread in my mind. In that circle, we told elderly resilience tales, stories about loss, survival, and the stubborn spark that refuses to go out, no matter the years. When it was my turn, I didn't mention names. I just said, sometimes the family you're born into doesn't see you. Sometimes, you have to plant yourself in new soil to grow again. The others nodded, and I realized this was my soil now. By the second week, the calls turned into messages. Some were long and pleading. Mom, please, we made a mistake. We just want to fix this. Some were short and sharp. You can't just cut us off like this. We're family. The word family hit me differently now. It used to carry the weight of belonging. Now, it felt like a chain someone else wanted to hold. I didn't answer. Not the calls. Not the texts. Not the emails that swung between guilt and flattery like a pendulum. My silence wasn't punishment, it was preservation. At Harbor Light, life had its own rhythm. Morning yoga in the courtyard. Helen teaching me how to make her grandmother's cornbread recipe. A Thursday afternoon trip to the local bookstore where the owner, a man in his 70s, greeted us like old friends and insisted we take a free bookmark. These were the moments that built senior empowerment stories worth telling, not about revenge, but about reclaiming the minutes and hours that had once been stolen by someone else's demands. Sandra stopped me in the hallway one afternoon. "Margaret, you have a visitor," she said. For a second, my stomach tightened. But when I stepped into the front room, it wasn't Emily or David. It was Melissa, the director from Harbor Haven. She had driven 3 hours to see the farmland I'd donated. "We want to turn it into a therapeutic garden," she said, unrolling a set of sketches across the table. Raised beds, walking paths, a small gazebo for shade. A place where active aging seniors and those with early memory loss can work side by side. Looking at those drawings, I felt something settle in me. Emily had asked for the garden for the kids. But here it would feed more than plants. It would feed dignity, connection,
Healing.
Later that evening, I sat in my room with the ocean breeze slipping through the window. My phone buzzed once, twice, then stopped. I knew without looking who it was. I reached for it, not to answer, but to turn it off completely. And as I set it face down on the table, I realized something. The knock on my door that I'd once feared, the confrontation, the tears, the guilt, had never come. Maybe it never would. And maybe that was the point. Because the people who truly saw me, the ones worth opening my door for, were already here. It happened on a Tuesday evening. I was carrying a plate of still warm cornbread to the long communal table in the dining room. The room was full, laughter rolling like a tide, the hum of overlapping conversations, the clink of silverware on ceramic. "Margaret, over here," Helen called, waving me to the spot she'd saved. There was no hesitation in my steps, no wondering if I belonged. I sat down, and the conversation folded me in as easily as if I'd been there all my life. That night, after dinner, Sandra asked if I'd consider leading the Thursday storytelling circle for the next month. "You have a way of drawing people out," she said. I thought about all the senior family stories I'd heard here, tales of cross-country moves, of love found at 70, of learning to dance after retirement. They weren't just emotional senior stories. They were living proof of the power of resilience. I agreed. And the next Thursday, I sat at the front of the circle, hands folded in my lap, and began with a truth that had taken me months to learn. Sometimes the life you think you've lost is just the life you've outgrown. I told them about Charleston, about Richard, about the trip I thought would be healing. I told them how I'd stood at the gate in LAX, realizing my return ticket had never been purchased, and how that was the moment my return to myself began. They listened, not with pity, but with recognition. When I finished, Helen leaned forward. "You didn't just survive," she said. "You rebuilt." In the weeks that followed, the garden project moved forward. Melissa sent me photos of the first raised beds going in, volunteers planting herbs and flowers. I printed one and pinned it to my wall. That patch of land wasn't just a garden anymore. It was part of a senior wellness story that would outlive me. One afternoon, as I was walking back from the library, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't check it right away, but when I did, it was a single text from Emily. "We're in town. Can we come by?" I stood there for a long moment, feeling the ocean breeze on my face. Then I typed back 2 words, "Not today." And I slid the phone back into my pocket, light as a feather. Because here, at Harbor Light, I already had a seat at the table. One I'd chosen, one I'd earned, one no one could pull out from under me again. 6 months after I arrived at Harbor Light, the garden at my old property was finished. Melissa sent me a video, rows of lavender swaying in the breeze, bright marigolds lining the walkways, a gazebo painted the same soft blue Richard and I had once chosen for our porch chairs. In the video, a small group of women, some with walkers, others with dirt under their fingernails, laughed as they planted tomatoes. One woman in a straw hat paused, looked at the camera, and said, "This place feels like home." I played it twice, then 3 times, letting the words settle into me. The land Emily and David wanted for the kids was now part of a senior empowerment story that would feed both body and spirit for years to come. That was my legacy, not a hand-me-down to those who had discarded me, but a living gift to those who would cherish it. Here at Harbor Light, I'd taken on more than the storytelling circle. I was helping plan the first Wellness Week, a celebration of active aging seniors with workshops, music, and even a small art show. My seagull that looked like a duck painting was proudly on display. Sometimes I thought about Charleston, about the house where Richard and I built our lives. But I didn't miss the walls. I missed him. And I realized that missing someone and missing a place aren't the same. The love we shared wasn't bound to a roof or a garden. It was here, in me, still growing. Emily and David still sent messages every few weeks, some polite, some desperate, some sharp. I read them when I felt strong enough, but I never replied. Not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I knew the truth. I couldn't return to a place where my presence was conditional. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was full of my choice. A choice to live among people who saw me, to spend my days in conversations that didn't carry an edge of transaction. This was the quiet center of my elderly resilience tale, the understanding that peace isn't given, it's made. On the evening of Wellness Week's opening day, I stood in the courtyard under the string lights. The tables were set with flowers from the garden. The air smelled faintly of rosemary, and somewhere inside, Helen was laughing her unstoppable laugh. I felt Richard with me, not in a ghostly way, but in the kind of way you feel the sun on your skin. I closed my eyes and thought, this is mine. I chose this. Sometimes, when the courtyard is quiet and the ocean air drifts in, I sit in my chair by the window and think about how easily my story could have ended differently. If I'd given in to the humiliation at that airport, if I'd taken the first bus back to Charleston and slipped quietly into the same walls that had been closing in on me, I would have stayed small. Instead, I chose to make the phone call. I chose to sign the papers. I chose to walk away. And those choices turned what could have been just another sad chapter in the catalog of emotional senior stories into one of the inspirational senior stories I used to read about but never imagined I'd live. People sometimes ask if I regret removing Emily and David from my will. The answer is no. I regret believing for so long that love meant sacrificing yourself, no matter the cost. I regret not planting myself in better soil sooner. But the garden I left behind is blooming, the community I joined is thriving, and the woman I see in the mirror each morning knows her worth. That's the thing about senior family stories we don't tell enough. They aren't always about mending broken ties. Sometimes they're about building new ones. Here at Harbor Light, my days are full. Mornings with coffee in the sunroom. Afternoons tending basil seedlings in the courtyard. Evenings spent in circles of people who call my name with warmth, not obligation. These are my senior wellness stories now, not about what I lost, but about how I live. Legacy isn't just money or land. It's the mark you leave on the people and places that will carry your story forward. Mine is in the raised garden beds back in South Carolina, in the herbs and flowers and tomatoes that will grow under the hands of other active aging seniors long after I'm gone. It's in the storytelling circle here, where I watch someone's eyes light up as they realize their life is worth sharing. And it's in me, a woman who walked into an airport with hope, was left with nothing, and walked out holding the pen to write the rest of her life. So if you're listening, and you've been left behind, underestimated, or made to feel like your time is over, hear me. It's not. You still have pages left. You can still choose where the next line goes. I did. And I'll keep writing until the very last page. Life has a way of teaching us that sometimes the family we're born into may not see our worth, and that's when we must find the courage to see it ourselves. Margaret's journey reminds us that love and loyalty are not obligations to be exploited. They are choices built on respect, care, and mutual trust. When betrayal or neglect comes from those closest to us, it can feel like the end of our story. But as Margaret showed, it can also be the start of a new chapter. One where you reclaim your voice, protect your dignity, and choose relationships that truly value you. Your legacy is not just about what you leave behind in material things, but in the lives you touch and the self-worth you preserve. The lesson is simple but powerful. Never confuse kindness with weakness, and never allow someone else's inability to see your value make you forget it. Whether you're starting over at 25 or 75, you have the right to build a life where you are respected, welcomed, and at peace. Thank you for watching the video. Please comment with number 1 to let me know you have watched the whole video. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell to always receive new videos as soon as possible.